Hi everyone, welcome to this new tutorial on this creepy creature in Blender. First of all the credit for the method of shaping the shell goes to Blender tutorial channel and Terry Cassidy. Make sure you check their channel out. So step 1, make a circle and offset it by -1 on the x-axis. To make the shell, we'll just repeat the circles with an array modifier. So go to the wrench tab, add the array modifier and increase the count by a lot, let's say 300. Opt for constant offset instead of relative offset and change the z-axis parameter to 0.25. Now we have a tower of 300 separate circles stacked vertically. We want them to loop in a spiral and the circles to decrease in size as they loop. And for that, we need another object to offset the array. So step 2, add an empty and offset it by -95 on the x-axis. Give it a rotation on the x-axis as well, let's say 12 degrees. And as we want smaller and smaller circles, we need to scale the empty down, so let's say to 0.99. Go back to the circle and the array modifier, take Object Offset and select the empty. And you get a shell, or at least a wireframe of a shell, which is pretty cool. And this is the quickest way I have found so far of making a hermit shell. If you want a smaller shell or less coils, play with the size and the rotation of the empty. So I just like to adjust the count here to make the tip of the shell nice and pointy, let's say 440, which is quite nice. And then just apply the modifier, and I tend to, just as a matter of habit, to convert it to mesh, although once the modifier is applied, you don't really need to. And delete the empty as we won't need it anymore. And then go to Edit Mode, select the Edges Selection mode, and then right-click Bridge Edge Loops to fill in the gaps in the mesh. And you have a shell. And now we'll just need a few little tweaks to give it a bit more geometry. So go back to Object Mode, select the shell, right-click Shade Smooth. And the shell hasn't got any thickness yet, so we can add another modifier. So go to the Modifier tab, add the Solidify modifier. Depending on your shell, you may want to keep the thickness quite low so it doesn't mess up with the tip of your shell if you have a lot of circle loops. So I just went actually with the bare minimum here, something like 0.02 or something like that. And once you're happy with it, you can actually add another modifier, which is the Subdivision Surface modifier, to smooth it out a bit more. Which I did as well. I just cranked up the render actually parameter, and then you can just apply the solidify modifier and then position your object how you want it to be for the final rendering, so then we can start shading it. So here I'm looking at it from different views and see how I want to position it. I just decided to rotate it slightly on a tilt, and this seems quite okay to me. And then just split the screen and go to the shading mode. I renamed the circle to shell. It's always good practice to name elements explicitly, and then configure rendering settings as well. I went for cycles and set it pretty low for this time, but you can crank it up if you wish based on your computer's configuration. So once everything's set, we can start shading, create a new material and rename it. I called it shell pattern, and click on rendering view so we can see what we're doing with the shading nodes. What I actually like is the world color to be pitch black, so if you prefer so too, click on world and set the background to black and go back to the object shader. As I want a repeated pattern on the shell, I first need a color ramp to control it. And then with the node wrangler enabled, press Ctrl T to connect the image texture, mapping and texture coordinate nodes. We don't want the image texture as we won't be using a picture texture or shell, so we'll substitute it for another, which is the Voronoi texture. And now we can change the parameters, but nothing seems to change in the shading, and it's because we're not using the proper texture coordinates that we need to make our pattern repeat. So if we opt for generated, as you can see, the Voronoi pattern is placated to our object. And if we change the scale or the color ramp settings, the pattern changes too. However, it's not quite what we want. What we actually want is for it to iterate from one coil to another and decrease in size too. So we can opt for different settings in the texture coordinate as well. So if we go for object, for example, it's not quite that either, because we have a recurring actually pattern of the same size. So we really have to opt for normal, and then we get the effect we're looking for. And in the Voronoi texture node, you can opt for smooth F1 as well, to have the polygonal shapes blend into one another, and then you can just play with the scale and the color ramp to achieve the look you prefer. So I went with different ones and I tried out different ways, but really here it's up to your own preference, and don't forget to play with all the parameters there are. For example, as well, the parameters in the principled BSDF shader node, if you wish. You can set the metallic, specular, roughness values to add really extra texture to a shell. I went with something quite smooth, but really, and I opted as well for black and white here, but you can just go crazy and select the colors you like and the textures you like, etc. It's really make it your own. So once you're happy with your shader for the shell, we can move on to creating the tentacles. Select the shell and go to edit mode and select the inner edge of the rim and press F to create a face. Keep it selected, then right click separate by selection. We now have a separate element from the shell. So go back to object mode and size it down, and as we'll be randomly instancing curves on that plane and we want to keep things simple, we actually don't want those curves to interfere with the geometry of the shell. So we don't want it to actually intersect and blend, etc. So size it down and go back and forth to edit mode, etc. to adjust the edge to the shell by moving the vertices, etc. Depending on how you've set up your shell, this may require some fine positioning. So just take the time it needs to do it properly, because this will really matter when we start instancing tentacles on it in our geometry node setup. Scale it down a fair bit because we won't be seeing anyway that plane. We'll just need the tentacles for it. So scale it down accordingly, really push it inside the shell, apply all transforms once you're happy with it, and really look from all the sides that it really fits in nicely. So once you're kind of happy with it, there are a few other things we'll just need to do. First is rename it and just call it what it is. I've called it Snail Tentacles here. In the shading mode, we just want to actually unlink it so it doesn't have any texture yet. And then we can go to geometry node section and start instancing curves on it. So with the plane selected, just click new, rename it. I called it Tentacles, but you can name it whatever you wish. And we will need 3 nodes to start with. We need the node distribute points on faces. We will need the instance on points node and something to act as an instance, which will be the curve line node. And that basic setup will give us actually the tentacles. But the tentacles will still look just like lines, and we will need a few more nodes to make them look like tentacles. So first we'll use the capture attribute node and normal node in combination with align Euler to vector, a couple of noise textures, and a map range node to add randomness to the rotation and scale. So here we've added the capture attribute and the normal nodes. Here comes the line unit to vector. We will use a Musgrave texture for the rotation randomness. And all that we will connect together. And the align unit to vector will help us with the direction as well. And you can just play with the different parameters, the factors, the scale, etc. to give direction and orientation to those curves. And we will add here a noise texture, which is the second texture that we will use to randomize, but this time the scale, in combination with a map range node to give it a bit more control in terms of the length of the curves. And of course, there is something that I forgot to change, is actually set the curve line end on the x-axis and not on the z-axis. And of course, one last thing is to change the float value of the capture attribute to vector. And now we have our tentacles, and now we can actually organize these nodes a bit more neatly and make room for giving some movement and flesh to those curves. So all those nodes for movement and flesh of the curves to turn them into tentacles will come after this initial setup. Here, just don't forget to reconnect if you've disconnected nodes by mistake. Play with the density and the seed as well to find something you like. And once we've organized them a bit more neatly, we can move on to the next bit. So we need a few nodes for that. We need realize instances, a set position node, a resample curve node, and a Musgrave texture again. For the Musgrave texture, I like using ridge multifractal setting here. And if your curves are too angular, you can just play with the resample curve node and increase the count to make them nice and smooth. And to animate the tentacles, switch to 4D, and for the W parameter, type in #frame divided by 250 to feed it the frame value divided by 250. I chose to divide it by 250 to make it slow and smooth, but if you want to animate it faster, opt for a lower value. And now we want to put some flesh on those wires. So we will add a trim curve node and link the Musgrave texture node to its end input. And we need to set the curve radius and to convert the curve to mesh and give it a profile. So we will create those two nodes, set curve radius and convert curve to mesh. And then add curve circle and connect it to the profile curve input. To make the tentacles pointy, we can add a color ramp and a spline parameter node. And we will connect the spline parameter node to FAC and the color ramp to radius. And we will invert the values of the color ramp and lower the radius parameter of the curve circle node until it's something we like. We'll quickly add at the very end the set material node for shading it later. But we can go back now to the first noise parameters on the geometry nodes tree and fine tune the settings and just hit play to animate it and see what it looks like. To me, this is actually the most time-consuming part. I found it quite difficult to find the sweet spot between the randomness, the noise, and the count of tentacles. And there's just one thing that looks a bit off here, and as you can see is the base of the tentacles. They move back and forth and don't really seem to be attached to the plane on which they are instanced on. And to fix that, we need to see that plane. And to do that, we can add the join geometry at the end of the tree and link the initial geometry to that node. And now we actually see it. We can Control A and apply all transforms. And this seems to have made things worse, but actually the second most important step is to set the origin to geometry. So it's really right click, set origin to geometry, and now the tentacles emerge and remain rooted to the plane. And now we can fine tune our parameters, and once you're happy with it, we can get to the final stage of this tutorial. So select the shell and go back to edit mode, and select again the inner edge of the rim and create a face by pressing F, and then separate by selection, and set origin to geometry and scale it down just a little and move it inwards. The idea here is to create that snail flesh that the tentacles emerge from. And once you're happy with it, let's shade it. So again, as it used to be a part of the shell, it has the shell pattern material linked to it, so separate it from the shell pattern, and let's create a new fleshy material by clicking on the number to keep the initial settings. We can now tweak without altering the shell one, and also rename the newly created element. I called it snail flesh, but you can call it whatever you like. And I chose to do it all in black and white, but feel free to go crazy on the colors and give it all really gooey and fleshy look. So we can now reuse the shell material and tweak it, and I substituted the Voronoi texture for a noise texture. And we can also set the texture coordinate from normal to object. And play with the noise texture and color ramp parameters until you find something you like. I don't think noise distortion works well here, but you might have a different opinion on that. So just play with different parameters, find something that works for you, and don't forget as well the principled shader parameters, because you can just add that extra gooey touch. So play as well with the color ramp, add different colors, swap them around, find something that works for you. I like the roughness quite high and the scale pretty low. And we will as well add some bump and displacement as well. Fine tune it all to your liking. So here comes the bump that the noise texture connects to, and the normal goes into normal in the principled. And just play with the strength as well, so you don't want it actually too high either. And add the displacement as well. And there's one last thing that you can do as well is with the color ramp. Just play with the colors, maybe use ease or B-spline to have a really gradual change between the colors. There you go. You can connect the alpha to alpha and use the alpha parameters to actually add a bit of transparency or translucency to it all. There's one thing you can do as well is to inset faces in edit mode to that plane and activate proportional editing to move the faces and model the plane to look a bit like a suction pad, or at least make it a little less flat. So Don't forget as well to adjust the geometry accordingly and move the vertices that interfere with the shell. You can select it by pressing C and circle select, and then just use proportional editing to give it a bit more shape than just a flat surface. And then you can just return to object mode once you've sorted that geometry out, and just shade it smooth. And really fill in the gaps or push them back inwards so they don't stick out of the shell. There, it took some time, but it's important to do it properly so it looks all nice and neat. Shade smooth, and there you go. Now press play and see what it looks like. Go back to render mode, and of course you could just leave the tentacles white, but you can also assign them a material. You can select the tentacles, go to the geometry nodes panel and set material node, add the snail texture in there. One last thing, you can choose to animate the flesh texture as well by opting for the 4D setting in the noise texture node and feed it in the frame rate divided by value of your choice. I opted to divide it by 500 to make it less nervy, as I think that here the slower the better, but it's really up to your own preference. So here you go. I hope you enjoyed it. And this is just a basic setting, and I have no doubt that you will improve it, make it better looking and more efficient. Really, thank you for watching, and feel free to share yours by dropping your link in comments. So take care and happy blending.